liked going on walks late at night or really early in the morning, like midnight or 3 a.m. I preferred this because I could be alone with just my thoughts or music and enjoy the atmosphere. The weather was typically perfect around this time for nothing more than shorts, a light jacket, and running shoes. I liked having music on one side and then listening to the wind blow around the leaves and the tree branches. It was actually quite peaceful and a great way to unwind and decompress, especially after a rough day. 9 out of 10 times it was at the same park, same walking trail as well. I had it down that I could probably walk the entirety of it with my eyes closed, but sometimes I wanted to change it up and would go to a different park a little further away. The first one was also close enough for me to walk to, so I didn't even drive there. I lived in a great community with very little crime, so I didn't even feel unsafe being out there that late. However, I did have a few situations that arose that made me protect myself a little more when I did go out. This occurred back in the autumn months. It was around 1 a.m. at this time and still pitch dark. At the beginning of the path, there was light along it coming from the moon and the street lights, but the further in you went, the darker it got as the trees blocked out a lot of the light. So I usually had a small, compact flashlight on me in case I needed it, but other than my phone, that's all I had on me. I was walking the path as normal, getting into the music and zoning out, when I started hearing what sounded like whimpering. Not like from an animal either, but like a person. Like they were holding back from crying. Like I said, the area this park was in was pretty upscale. There wasn't a lot of crime, and thinking back, I don't remember ever hearing any reports of something happening in that park either. So when I heard this at first, I just ignored it, thinking maybe someone was needing some time alone too. As I continued walking, the whimpering got louder until I could hear a cracking sound. I made a mental note of the area I was in, but again, I kept walking. However, my curiosity got the best of me when I started hearing crying and an alarming conversation. I could hear a woman crying and saying things like, "I'm sorry, please, just stop, please, let's just go home." I could also hear a very angry man saying, "You need to shut the hell up," among other unpleasantries. I started slowing down and turned off my music so I could pinpoint where they were. As I looked through the trees, there was a small opening where I could see the silhouettes of 2 people. I had managed to walk right past them, and I assumed neither of us noticed each other. I stopped where I was and leaned on the closest tree, hoping they would continue to think they were alone. I watched as I saw the guy drag this woman by her wrist deeper in the trees. He then grabbed her by the hair, yelling something at her, and shoved her to the ground. After some shuffling, I saw him pick something up off the ground, like a stick or a tree branch that had fallen. The last thing I heard from him was something along the lines of, "You brought this on yourself." Now, in case anyone asks why I didn't do something sooner or do more, I myself was a small woman as well. I was 5'4" and 190 pounds at the time. There was no way I was going to be able to do anything to this guy. I may not have been able to see him clearly, but he had to easily be 6 foot and 200 to 300 pounds. He had a similar build to my boyfriend at the time, so that's what I was basing it off of. I definitely didn't want to leave this woman out here with him, knowing this could easily be the last terrifying moments of her life, so I dialed 911 on my phone and held it with the screen facing my chest in hopes of blocking out the light. Then I just yelled the first thing that came to mind. "What the hell is going on?" I heard the woman gasp and the man stood up and froze. I started saying the address of the park out loud, hoping the operator would hear it too. They both went completely silent, and I was holding as still as I could, praying this guy wouldn't see me. Then the guy pointed at her and said, Next time I catch you, you're freaking dead," and took off through the other side of the trees. I waited several more seconds, making sure the guy didn't come back, and then picked up the phone to tell the operator what was going on, and they assured me they already had someone on the way. I started to approach the woman as she asked, "Is someone there?" I told her it was okay and that the cops were on their way. I walked with her back to the entrance so they could find us, all while still on high alert that this guy could easily come back and try to attack us both. Thankfully, if he did plan on doing that, the cops beat him to it. I told them what I saw and heard, but the lady claimed she didn't know the guy. I don't think the cops believed her either, since I told them I heard her say something about going back home. Of course, they can only do so much since he didn't stick around and she didn't want to go to the hospital. Regardless, I'm glad I did something because I definitely wouldn't be able to live with myself if I didn't and it was on the news the next day. After the woman hugged and thanked me, one officer agreed to follow her home, and since I walked there, the second officer took me home, which I was fine with that. The mood was definitely ruined for that walk, nor did I even feel comfortable being there. I don't know whatever happened to her, but I hope she's okay and that he got caught. As for me, it took a few months before I walked that park at night, but no matter where I go, you won't find me without pepper spray and a pocket knife now. This is a story about me, my childhood friend Rachel, and this boy that moved into our neighborhood. We'll call him Norman. Rachel and I became fast friends because our moms went to college together. She lived a block over from me, and we were inseparable. We rode the same bus, ate lunch, and played at school together. We also typically spent the weekends at each other's house, unless there were other family plans. Rachel had a baby sister at the time, and I had a brother that was 4 years older than me. One year, my parents got one of those small above-ground pools, but it was so much fun having it as a kid. Now that we had it, we hung out a lot more at my place. However, we still shared the pool with my brother and his friends if they ever came over. They were all right for the most part. I think it was just a normal older brother thing to start annoying their younger siblings and show off when their friends were around. Otherwise, we typically got along. We had a few kids around the neighborhood that would ask to come over to swim too, and we never really had a problem with it. If we did, I'd usually just make up some excuse about having to get out by a certain time, so they would leave and then Rachel and I would enjoy the time to ourselves. Unfortunately, our tricks would become a little harder when Norman moved in. Norman moved onto the same street I lived on when I was finishing grade school, but he was a year older than me. He was an only child, and while he and his parents seemed nice at first glance, there was definitely something wrong with the family picture. They moved into the house across from us one summer in the early 2000s. When Rachel and I would ride our bikes between our homes, we would occasionally see Norman sitting on the front porch or looking out the big front window. I let Rachel know who he was and explained what I knew about him. My mom had seen his mom when she was getting her mail and introduced herself. I told her that he would be going to our school with us this upcoming year. Rachel was always a lot nicer and more reserved than myself, though, so one time she suggested we invite him to hang out with us. After a bit of debating, I finally agreed, thinking, if anything, we could probably pawn him off on my brother if he wanted another boy to hang out with. So after getting permission to ride our bikes to the little gas station to get ice cream, we saw Norman sitting outside and stopped to ask if he wanted to join us. At first, he was shy and said he didn't have a bike. I was going to just offer to have him walk with us, but Rachel said that he could use hers and she would ride with me. Sometimes she would just sit on the bike handles. He accepted this, and as he started getting on, Rachel asked him about telling his parents first, to which he said it would be fine. We mentioned this later on to each other because even though we knew the neighborhood, we couldn't leave the yards without asking first. So that trip went fine, as well as the rest of the night. We bought his ice cream because he didn't have any money, and we just sat out on our porch and ate it and talked. We even had to buy something for my brother, so he sat out there with us. I remember that Norman and my brother got along at first. They had similar interests, so he'd come over and hang out with both of us. Being the summer, this included many visits to the pool. We invited Norman over to swim as well, and I remember him wearing swim trunks that were too big for him, so my brother actually gave him a pair of his that he didn't wear anymore. He told us that his parents didn't have a lot of money, so he had a lot of hand-me-downs from his father, including the swim trunks. I started to feel bad for him. His family obviously didn't have a lot of money and maybe didn't even care much about his whereabouts because he never asked them to leave or told them he was leaving. So we tried to include him in more things that we did and even came over for dinner a few times. After a while, he would come over and ask for my brother, and then if he wasn't home or was busy, he'd just go over to where we were. Most of the time it was fine, but he started getting weird. When we were playing with dolls, sometimes he'd ask to play, which we were surprised about because my brother never wanted to play with us. With that though, we'd let him join, but he would make them do weird things. He'd say they were getting drunk, they'd start fighting and beating each other. The worst we would do is if they were fighting over a dress or falling off a cliff and were saved. So this would throw us off and we'd go to do something else. Swimming was usually it because it got him outside and we could always make up our curfew again. So out we'd go to hang out, and sometimes we'd just swim around and make up games in the pool, but he'd start getting too rough. We'd splash around, but he would just force so much water at us at one time that it would get annoying. One time my brother came out to swim and we said we were going in so it'd just be them. Once we went in though, he'd calm down. I mentioned this to my parents one time and my dad teased that he was probably doing it because he liked one of us and didn't know how to express it. My mother, on the other hand, said that since he was an only child, he probably just didn't realize he was being too rough and that we should just tell him we're not comfortable with it and ask him to stop. I agreed and said I would try that next time. If anything, I could always go in and get my parents too. However, things escalated a little more than just splashing. One time he came over to swim, he started talking about how someone drowned in a pool like ours before and was talking about gruesome things that happened to the person. Creeped out after never hearing about things like that before, I asked him how he knew about that, and he said his dad showed him some stuff about it. His parents just seemed more and more like winners. I could tell Rachel was starting to become uncomfortable, so I immediately tried to change the subject and we suggested we play a game. Norman suggested we play lifeguard, so Rachel asked how to play. The smile he gave, I will never forget. It still gives me goosebumps. He said someone had to pretend like they were drowning, while the other one saves the other person. Our immediate thought was to float on our back, while someone else used a pool noodle to pull us to the side. Sounded interesting, so we agreed. He said he would be the lifeguard and would save us, so we both immediately floated on our backs, and I closed my eyes waiting to be saved. He said we had to yell for help, so we both sarcastically started saying help and flailed our arms a bit. After a few seconds of this, I stopped and continued to just float as I continued to hear flapping and splashing, followed by Norman laughing. Curious, I opened my eyes and looked over and was scared to death. Norman was holding Rachel under the water, laughing as she struggled. I screamed at him, "What were you doing?" when he said, "I'm showing her how to drown." I immediately ran over and started pushing and punching him to let her go. And about the same time, he finally did, and she came up gasping. My brother ran out the back door with my mom. Rachel's in tears and we were hugging while Norman continued laughing. Between sobs, I tried explaining what had happened while he was trying to defend himself, saying it was just a joke. Thankfully, my mom told him he needed to go home, and we watched as he left, continuing to laugh. We got out and stayed inside the rest of the night watching movies. Rachel was fine after that, thankfully, but Norman was not allowed over anymore. I overheard my mom and dad talking one night because my dad had actually gone over to Norman's house to tell his parents about what he did, and their only response was, "Well, boys will be boys." Sorry, but my brother has never tried to drown either one of us. This didn't stop Norman's torment, though. Usually it was just him going outside as we were riding by to throw stuff at us. We ended up having to buy a pool cover and a lock to our gates because he thought it would also be funny to throw dead animals in our pool. Squirrels, rabbits, frogs, snakes. I don't even know where he caught them, but he did it, and it was disgusting. We knew it had to be him because he'd always be nearby when we found it. We had to have the pool completely drained and cleaned because of this. So Rachel meant well, but I think she learned her lesson on being so trusting with just anyone that looked lonely. And in case you're curious, the next year we were starting our first year in middle school. He was expelled after missing so many days and then tried to bring a knife to school. He was supposedly homeschooled from then, but learning that his parents were drunks, his mom was a caregiver without any licensing, and his dad worked in a car shop, so I have my doubts. Oh, and he's also done time for drugs and indecent exposure, so there you go. Stay in school, kids, and don't try to drown your neighbors. My parents owned a few condos that they rented out in Florida. While I was in college, I helped them out with repairs, cleanup, and miscellaneous things that they needed done at the time. It could be hard work at times, but it was also steady income, so I didn't have to worry about it while in school. They definitely got some really weird tenants and situations at times. Here's a few in particular that I remember having the pleasure to deal with. My parents had rented a condo to a younger couple one year. They did their normal interview, but learned they didn't have much in the way of a rental background. My dad was always a softie and was more willing to give people a chance though, so they agreed to let them move in for a higher deposit plus last month's rent, so they at least had some money in the bank in case anything went sour. Everything was fine for like 5 or 6 months. Then they started calling about plumbing issues. We had never had issues reported before, so thought maybe they just clogged it. My dad went out there and checked on it and had to have it snaked when they pulled out a condom. I remember the conversation as my dad tried to explain what it was to my mom, and I thought it was funny at first. But then it would set in that these grown adults tried to flush this. So he had to explain to them that they can't flush stuff like that. They promised they wouldn't and moved on from there. From then, we stopped hearing from them at all. Instead of dropping off a check or cash at my parents' place, they started mailing money orders. Then they stopped getting rent altogether. They tried calling several times and they never answered. It appeared like they were purposely ignoring their calls, as it would go to voicemail after ringing 2 to 3 times. So I tried calling from my phone. The guy answered, and when I started introducing myself, he hung up on me, and then the girl never picked up from then on. After 4 months of no payments, my parents filed the order to evict them since they wouldn't even talk to them. I went with my dad and the cop to give the order. After knocking several times and no answer, my dad unlocked the door and the smell immediately hit us. It reeked of cigarette smoke, and the unit is supposed to be non-smoking. The walls were painted a sand color, and you could see the streaks of brown from the nicotine. There was trash all over the kitchen and crammed in corners, under the bed and the couch. There were dishes piled up on one side of the sink with the darkest water with a green-looking foam forming on it. It was disgusting. And even better, the toilet looked like it was busted in the back and brown on the inside like it hadn't been used in a while. It was obvious the place was abandoned and just left like this, so we were going to have to start cleaning it. After a few days of cleaning, my dad told me that he would have to replace the toilet and asked me to go over there to sign for it as they were going to be delivering it there, so I agreed. I got to the condo, go to unlock the door, when I realized it was cracked open some. My dad changed the locks, so my first thought was maybe he had gotten there before I did and just didn't bother telling me. So I walked in, called out for my dad, and the next thing I remember was an awful pain in the back of my head. Then I remember some guy standing over me asking me my name, if I knew where I was, things like that. Apparently the previous tenants had come back for their stuff and were shocked that they couldn't get into the place and broke a window around back to get in. I also spooked them and they decided to smack me in the back of the head with a rubber mallet, knocking me out cold and stealing like $60 from my wallet. The guy that was bringing the toilet saw the door was open, saw me lying on the floor and called an ambulance. We never saw them again, but my parents and I filed charges in case they ever try to come back. I was just thankful that's all they did, as they could have left me in a much worse condition. Another weird one was an older lady that moved in. She had been there for a long time. I remember going over there for random maintenance things like helping with the AC, air filters, or light bulbs that she couldn't reach. She kept the place clean for the most part, but I think she started getting Alzheimer's or something as she started acting differently. My own grandfather had it, so I recognized some of the same things she did or said. She started calling for the same maintenance things within the same month or weeks, even though they didn't need attention, and it got harder and harder to explain to her that we've already done it, as she wouldn't believe us. Thankfully, she did have kids that came over sometimes to check on her, and they told us that they were going to be moving her into a nursing home. Again, my dad being who he was, he told them not to worry about the lease as long as they got her stuff out, so we didn't have to, and we would call it even. They took a few weeks to get everything out, but it was less than a month, and we went in to start cleaning. They got most of the stuff out and was actually still pretty clean. We were thinking it was going to be a pretty simple job until we opened the fridge. It was pretty gross. The back inner wall was covered in a dark, sticky liquid. There was stuff spilled all over the bottom of the fridge. I don't know if it was blood or food that leaked, but I remember having to basically use a metal scraper to get it all off. But in the bottom drawer of the fridge, there was a loose plastic bag. I grabbed it, ready to throw it in the trash, when I noticed it was super light, but whatever was in it kind of moved around like rice or beads. So stupid, curious me opened it up to see what it was. It was full of teeth, and not like human teeth either, but cat or dog teeth, because there were a lot of those long fang-like ones. And there was a lot in there. And even worse, I never saw an animal in this place while she was here, so I have no idea where the hell they came from. I don't know what Granny was doing in her spare time, but I'm glad I was never on her bad side. Those were two that I remember really well because they were probably some of the weirdest ones, but they've definitely had all kinds of weirdos in there. I still occasionally help them, but I have a full-time job now, which I prefer instead of cleaning up after others. People are too damn weird and hard to trust. This happened several years ago when a few high school buddies of mine and I decided that we wanted to get together and do our own kind of 10-year reunion celebration. We were never the cool kids, so we kind of just thought it would be a waste of time to even bother with a real reunion, and decided that a camping trip would better fit our interests. We had all kind of dispersed around the Midwest, so it was difficult to get all of the logistics sorted out, but my buddy Ray had family that lived out west in pretty much the middle of nowhere, but in a really nice, nature-laden part of the state. What was even better, they owned some remote land, and they were okay with us setting up our camp on their property so long as we didn't cause any damage to the natural formations. So it was an absolute win on our part. We set up the date and times and decided that we would all go out the first weekend in May and spend most of the week out in a really nice area, just enjoying the weather and the surrounding nature. I was honestly super excited to go on this trip, as I hadn't seen a couple of the guys since we graduated, though we kept in touch over things like Facebook. The logistics went like this. I was going to head out that way by car with my pal Joe. Ray and Mark were going to drive out together, and Brent was going to drive out with Dave. Basically, it was going to be a road trip with two of us per car, heading from different locations, and we had a hotel that we'd be staying in for the first night. We were all going to meet up there, then head out to the campgrounds, as that would just make it easier for everyone to go at the same time. Like I said, I was pretty psyched, as this was probably the most exciting thing I'd done in a long time, and I loved road trips. The drive there goes about as expected, fairly uneventful, with it pretty much just being a drive across parts of the Midwest, though the mountainous region was obviously gorgeous. I was the one driving for the first half, Joe for the second, and we got there in pretty good time considering how far it was. We were the second group to make it to the hotel, and the other guys, Ray and Mark, pulled in a few hours later. We all spent the night at a local bar catching up, playing pool, and just having a great night. After spending a few hours out and just enjoying ourselves, we opted to go ahead and call it a night and head back to our hotel rooms. When the morning rolled around, we had our fancy hotel breakfast of just add water eggs and microwave bacon, then all headed back onto the road. We followed Ray's car, and after about 45 or so minutes, we ended up in an area that pretty much seemed like the middle of nowhere. He parked and got out. Joe and I kind of gave him a look like, "Are you sure this is where we're supposed to be?" But he reassured us that he knew the area from when he spent the summer with his aunt as a kid. In the end, all we could do was trust him. We parked the cars and got all of our camping gear out, walked a couple 100 yards away until we had all decided that the spot was perfect, and started setting up. After a bit of time, we all got our tents set up. We decided to set them up with the 6 tents in a semicircle, all facing toward where we had parked the cars. Once night started rolling around, we set up our small pit and lit a fire, then all sat around and started reminiscing about our years in high school. It was probably one of the best nights I'd had in a long time, just sitting there with my old pals from high school, talking about the days when we were young, and then catching up on random things in our lives. What made it all the better was that the property owned by Ray's aunt was legitimately in the middle of nowhere. There were only dirt roads, no street lights, and no cell reception. It was probably around 10 or so when Brent pointed out that there was a car driving down one of the dirt roads. We all kind of sat there and watched it pass. It was pretty far away from us, but it was the only car that we'd seen all night. Ray laughed and said it was probably just one of the neighbors cutting through the back roads for whatever reason. He mentioned that the dirt roads over this way were used pretty much by the people that knew my aunt and people that were running illegal goods, mostly because the cops never came this way. Dave asked what kind of illegal goods, and as nonchalantly as he could be, Ray just said, drugs for the cartel. Obviously, we were all a bit shaken by that, but he didn't tell us that we were going to be sleeping on a cartel trail. He tells us that it's fine and that we didn't have to worry. His reasoning was pretty much that if they were running drugs across the area, they weren't going to pay them any mind because it would look more suspicious. They would just pass on by and keep going, never giving us a second glance. All we could do was trust him. After a couple more hours of chatting and drinking the beer we had brought, we all decided that it would be a good idea to call it a night. We all got into our tents, and I was struggling to fall asleep for some dumb reason. I was lying there for about half an hour, tossing and turning, and just generally feeling uncomfortable, when I noticed there was a light shining in the direction of our tents. I sat up and watched it get brighter and closer for a few moments, then it stopped moving. Within a few moments, the silence of the small forest was interrupted with the sound of a gunshot and a man yelling for all of us to get out of our tents. Inside, I was freaking out, obviously thinking about the cartel coming to rob us or murder us for being on their turf. In my defense, I was tired and a bit buzzed. He started shouting again that if we didn't get out of our tents, he was going to have to get us out, and that he had plenty of zip cuffs to make it happen, which was more than enough for me to get my ass up and open the door to the tent. I think the other guys were just as freaked out because everyone else exited their tent around the same time, everyone except Ray. We all got out, and in front of us was an old man holding a handgun in his right hand and a shotgun strapped to his back. It was pretty clear that he was in control of the situation and that he was going to be ready to take on any threats. I remember him saying something along the lines of, "I saw you boys out there a few hours ago. I gave you plenty of time to leave. Now we're going to have to do this the hard way." Before he unclipped his collection of zip cuffs, all of us were in mild panic, but apparently I was the only one that thought we should say something. "Wait, sir, we know who owns this land. We're not here to cause any trouble or anything. If we need to leave, we can find a new place to set up camp or go back to a hotel or something." He paused for a moment and looked over at me, then asked me how we knew the owner, and I tried to tell him that she was a family member of one of us, but he was still in the tent. At first, it looked like he didn't believe me, but after I pointed to the only closed tent and said that he was in there, he motioned for me to open the tent, then said, "Don't do anything stupid. You move wrong at all, and they'll be burying you out here." This statement made me all but piss my pants, but I moved over to the tent with my hands up and then slowly unzipped it. I tried to wake Ray up by saying, "Ray, get up. There's a crazy dude out here with a gun." Of course, he had more to drink than I did, and he was less than responsive. I whisper shouted it again, and after a few seconds, he finally opened his eyes. I told him that we needed him outside immediately because we were all about to die. He slowly and groggily sits up and then stands to get out of the tent. After a few seconds of taking in the scenes, he half drunkenly says, "Oh, hey, Mr. Carls, what are you doing out here?" The look on the old man's face changed completely. He went from murderous intent to looking like he just saw his own grandson for the first time. He quickly holstered his gun and stepped forward to give Ray a hug. After the tensions were a bit more settled, and we were done having our panic attacks, we learned who this man was. Ray told us that Mr. Carls was his aunt's next-door neighbor and had been for as long as they'd lived there, and apparently, the last time they'd seen each other, Ray was around 12. When we asked why he was creeping around on Ray's aunt's property, ready to put a new hole in anyone he saw, apparently his aunt was out of town and asked Mr. Carls to watch the property for trespassers, a job that the old man took very seriously. Also, his aunt had apparently forgotten to mention to the old man that we would be coming up for our camping trip. So when he saw our camp, he thought we were going to be there for a little bit and leave, which was a common thing for drifters. When he saw that we were still there, he apparently strapped up and decided that he was going to take us all into the sheriff's department himself, hence the sip cuffs. In the end, we stayed the full week and enjoyed the time together. Mr. Carls even came out to have a beer with us a couple times and brought us some food that his wife had made. Not exactly the norm for camping cuisine, but it was quite nice. I will say that as much as I really did enjoy this trip and hanging out with some of my old friends, having a gunshot right outside my tent and then pointed at my face because an old man thought we were trespassers has made it to where I really don't think I want to go camping again. Hello, friends. So that was a collection of true scary stories. Sometimes the random ones like this can have some crazy stuff in it too. And that's kind of what I like about it, never knowing what you'll hear, right? So if you liked what you heard, feel free to hit that thumbs up button. And if you want to hear more like this, consider subscribing. You can also leave me a comment with your thoughts or even let me know how your day was. Do you have any plans or goals for the new year? I'd love to hear them. With that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic week. And until next time, take care.